My dearest Monice, in the blackest hour of the night, the moonbeams reflected a paleness onto the graveyard's pebblestones that crunched beneath my feet. It is only by this fraction of light that I was able to guide myself. My hands held tight about the shovel whilst the wind smothered me coldly, yet I persisted past the tombs and charnel markings, breathing hard and slightly grunting as some wounded animal. Though my course through the cemetery was to be secretive and silent, the steps I made broke through this nocturne's disturbing quiet, and I was forced to walk upon the graves, walking where the wind lingers and where the remains of diseased men lay sleeping eternally beneath the soil. The grave I sought was of no ordinary man, but a vile and scorning creature who acted in the most wretched forms of discipline, whose thoughts of pleasure came from the sight of your pain, and whose only need was to watch the tears willfully spill from your blood-stained eyes. He had stood approximately 4 feet tall in his living days and had some eyes that I can only describe as popped and wildly wide, yet here is where the horrors of this man's affliction begins to question fact. Horns, they had said, and even some sort of protrusion of hair on the backside that gave the insulting illusion of a bushy tail. There were said to have been 5 teeth in his mouth, 3 above and 2 below, aiding certain areas in his story that tell of him gnawing the arms and legs of his victims to a bloody stump. This dead man that I sought, whom I had begun to think grotesquely fabled, was said to have had the most atrocious hands, long fingers with claw-like nail endings, grappling men and women with the tight grip of an arachnid. His deformity had been by birth. However, just before his death, supposed death that is, he acquired some disease whose medical name escapes me. It was a dreary unease that caused his skin to grow thin, so thin that you could watch the blood of this creature, the veins, both blues and reds, wrapping about his odd body and twisting through his brittle bones. You could even see the brain, they claimed, plotting monstrous things beneath the skull. The transparency of the cerebral membrane so vivid that the gray matter of his mind called to you with devious intent. I was anxious to find his corpse, anxious to rip apart the earth in sight of this monstrosity, for the sight of his rotting bones would provide astounding conclusion at long last, finality to my own trepidation, and would determine the security of my future. The sight of his decayed remains would solidify whether I might live or die. In order for me to correctly convey to you the terror behind this tragedy, I must confess to you that I was a rotten child. I was always involved in the worst kind of pranks and would throw wild fits of rage when denied whatever I wanted. This was much to bear on my father. It was such a devotion to his career, and with no wife to help raise me, for my mother died giving birth to me, I was left throughout the first half of my life unpunished for my bad words and bad deeds. Now, when I was 12 years old, my father was reported missing. The investigations ran for some many months until at long last his body was found at the bottom of a wishing well. He had been strangled with a rope. No suspect or murderer was charged, and the haunting thought of no one to blame sent me reeling towards an eternal mistrust of man. I was sent to live in an orphanage run by some Benedictine nuns until my 18th year. It is here in this cold and drafty place that I learned of the acts of punishment. My sly ways were quickly corrected with the backsides of hands or the broken ends of sticks, but by the time I left the orphanage I was a proper young man who did no malicious thing nor spoke unjustly of another. I met your mother when I was 20 years old, and soon we married. You were born 2 years later, and we named you after my mother, Monice. Now, here is where the strange slants in my story begin to unfold. On the day that you were born, one of the nuns from the orphanage came to pay your mother and I her respects, but from her lips came the most unsuitable advice. She said that when you should behave badly, your mother and I should punish you roughly, so roughly that you should wish death on us. Hardly the things to say on such a day of living praise. The nun continued to warn us, saying that neglect of your punishment would do nothing but invite grief, that we would eat our own throats if we did not strike at you for the mildest of misbehaviors. I did not remember her name, but remembered well her stings and lashes when I misbehaved as a child, and these things I wished never to bear upon another, let alone my only child, my only holy one. 2 years after that visit, you behaved just as I had, Monice. As I, Monice, you were just as rotten a child, forever unscolded for your behavior. And I never found it within me to harm you, to punish you rather, for your ill manners, even though you did behave so wildly, and even more so at the age of 3. At this point, the nun returned yet again with the same odd request.
I'm nearly at the point of begging you to be firm with your daughter.
I would not have invited her in had she not brought to mention my father's death and the man who was responsible for its doing. Having halted her promptly at the door, a twisted grin came across her holy face, and she said,
I remember you being a lad, being torn by your father's death. Let me help you put an end to that madness, dear. Let me tell you what happened to your father. Did you know that he was at our orphanage too? Some years back, well before you were born, when your father came to stay with us, we gave our basement to a man named John Michael, who performed for us in a most unusual manner. He was our...
She peered skyward, whispered a quick prayer through tight teeth.
Our punisher, you might say, who disciplined the children for us.